I'm going to be showing you how I made these really cute fabric book covers, and I have various different sizes here because I was trying to figure out the appropriate measurement for the majority of my books so that I could get more use out of the covers. Although I am a person that likes to change things up, I like pretty things, so there is a chance that I'll make tons of these even though they're all the same sizes, just different fabric prints. I think it would be fun to have different seasonally appropriate prints on my book covers. So anyway, the first two ones that I made are these, and while they work for some of my books, the measurements weren't quite as flexible to be putting them on other books that I have in my collection. For one, the very first version that I made is a bit too small, and I will show you how I measured out these fabric book covers to create a pattern myself, and that way you can actually draft your own pattern at home if you'd like. Now this book cover is so small, it only actually covers a couple of my books. This one is Harry Potter, and so that's what this looks like. I also have this one. This one was slightly bigger because I wanted to be able to accommodate longer books. For instance, this book here has over 625 pages. So I wanted it to be able to expand, see 637. I wanted it to be able to expand over a larger book. So I did change the measurements up, but I still wasn't completely happy with the design of it. And I kind of felt like having both of these flaps, these slide-in pockets, made it to where some books it would fold the corners of the books, and I really don't want to damage my books. I think it's much nicer to be able to slip one side into a pocket and have the other one be able to slide back and forth without restriction so that I don't mess up the corners of my books. And while this is very pretty and I do plan on using it as is, I wanted my other versions to be a little bit more gentle on my books, but still a very beautiful book cover. And now I have these two versions that were my last ones that I made, and I created the measurements on my pattern that I think are most appropriate for the majority of my books, and I'll show you the size reference so that you know what I'm talking about. But I made one that is thicker so that it can accommodate really thick, long books. And this particular book has less than the pages in this book. However, it seems to be much thicker. I don't know if you can see that. It's much thicker than this one. And I think it definitely has something to do with font size. So anyway, I have two different sizes here to share with you. The majority of my books are relatively the same measurement. They are different thicknesses, but the height and the width of them is pretty similar. So I wanted to create a pattern that would work with multiple different books that I have in my collection, whether they be short books or longer books like the ones that I just showed you. Now these books are all somewhere around 250 to 300 pages, whereas the books I showed you previously were 600 plus pages. So I wanted to create a book cover that would work for both lengths of books. So I did come up with an adjustable version. Now I typically read on my Kindle, and I do that because it's more convenient. The books are often slightly cheaper, and I don't have a ton of storage because of all of my crafting. I do have a lot of books, and I have way too many books as it is that I just could not part with. So my collection was getting a little bit out of control. So I have decided to download a lot of my books, but I do still buy paperback, especially when they are on sale or just not available on Kindle or Kindle Unlimited. And so anyway, the adjustment that I made was I created this flap here so that this side can freely move and slide while this side is tucked completely into a flap secured on this side. It just helps to prevent messing up the corners of the book. So I did create this flap, and I do like this option. However, I saw on Instagram that there is a company that sells fabric covered book covers that actually has this elastic across to hold your pages or to hold your books in place, but then this flap here extends, and you can actually have another elastic band here that wraps around the book. So then your book is completely covered, no exposure on the outside, which is definitely a good option. The only problem is once you start reading, I don't know how secure the back of this book is going to be with just the elastic. So I did opt to go ahead and continue to put this flap so that it can be folded inside. However, I do like the idea of possibly adding a snap closure so that when I'm not using the book, it can be snapped closed just like that, and I think that looks really nice. So that's definitely an option that you can do on your own. But for this tutorial, I'm just going to show you how I create a pattern that does this. Let's talk about the items that you're going to need in order to create this project. So you're going to need some 1/2 inch elastic, or whatever width of elastic that you think is appropriate for your book cover. You're going to need some sewing clips, and this is just to hold your project together as you sew. If you prefer to use pins, you can obviously use pins as well, but when doing crafty projects, I almost always use clips. You're going to need both paper scissors and fabric scissors because you're going to be cutting your pattern as well as your fabric. You're also going to need some tape if you are using more than one piece of paper in order to create the correct width or length of your pattern pieces. You're going to need some fat quarters, or just fabric in your stash will work just fine. Now, this fabric is one that I had in my stash. You're going to need an exterior piece of fabric as well as a lining piece of fabric. And I use only scraps and fabric in my stash for this project, but it does not require a ton of fabric. And I actually chose to do a non-directional print because, as you can see, for this one, somehow I cut it out upside down. So when I sewed it together, now my book cover is upside down, and if you read the book this way, all the words are upside down. So I'm reading it like this, which is perfectly fine for me. But if you were going to gift this to someone, or if you just want yours to be perfect, then I definitely would recommend that you use a fabric that doesn't have a certain direction that it needs to lay in order for the print to make sense. So you're going to need at least 2 fat quarters. You're also going to need some type of cushion in order to give it this bouncy protective feel on the outside. And so for me, for the ones that I've made in the past, I have used this here. This is a Balsal NR Foam Plus Unique Fusible Foam Stabilizer, and it's not super thick, but it is kind of pricey. I did purchase this on Amazon, I want to say a year ago, and I used it for the bottom of tote bags to give them some stabilization so they would sit up. It's very spongy and soft, and it does iron onto your fabric. Another option is this Pellon quilting batting. It's very thin, like the fusible stuff, only this does not fuse. And now this can be purchased at Joann, and I think that is where I purchased this one. I have not opened the pack yet. It basically does the same thing as the fusible stuff, only it will not fuse to your fabric. So it will be like having a 3rd layer in your project. You're going to need a ruler to help you measure out the pieces to create your pattern. You are also going to need some paper to create your pattern. And so you are going to need either pattern drafting paper here, or you can use whatever paper you have at home. For instance, this is 2 large pieces of construction paper that I've taped together in order to make it long enough to draw my pattern on. So you'll be able to see it's just slightly larger than the largest construction paper. So if you have construction paper, or your kids have construction paper, you can just borrow some of their paper or print together printer sheets, and that will work just fine. Let's get started. We are going to be creating 2 pattern pieces for this book cover, and I will be walking you through the steps of measuring out the exact measurements to create this pattern. Now, you can choose to do a thinner book cover depending on the thickness of books that you typically like to buy, but I personally made one pattern that accommodates 2 different sizes. So it's hard to see because I used a highlighter, but as you can see, there is a fold line here that I can fold this down in order to create a smaller book cover, and the pattern will work for both. I just felt like that was better and easier for me to keep track of the pieces. Regardless of the length that you choose to create, you are going to be using the same size for this book cover flap here. And that is the piece that your book actually slides into. So that's what this is, okay? For this pattern, we are creating a 1/2 inch seam allowance to go all the way around the book cover when you are sewing. Now, I will be giving you a clips of me using my sewing machine, but this isn't a video to teach you how to sew and use a sewing machine. So I do want to mention that for all of your sewing seams, you are going to do a back stitch at the beginning and at the end of sewing. But that's as far as I'm going to go into how to sew with your sewing machine. All right, so what I wanted to do was reduce the number of pattern pieces that I would have to create, which is why I have added the additional length onto this one pattern piece to create 2 different sizes. And the longer width of this pattern will accommodate those thicker books that you have, whereas the shorter length, when you fold this down, that will be able to accommodate the less thick books. Now, if you decide to make just this thick one and use it for all of your books, I think that's a really great idea. However, I think that if you're going to do that, you may want to do what I had mentioned before and add a thicker piece of elastic here on the inside so that you could wrap it around the book and close it up. And then that way it will take care of the extra length if your book is not as thick as this one. And I actually might do that just for the sake of testing out my theory. Now I'm going to show you how to determine how long your pattern piece should be. Now I do believe the measurements that I selected will be appropriate for most books, but if you have a larger book or a smaller book than the measurements that I'm going to be sharing with you in this video, then I'll show you what you need to do. The first thing that I did is I measured the width of my book. This is 5.5 inches, and the length of the book, which is 8 inches. And now that is pretty much standard, the measurements of height and width for the books in my collection. What varies is the depth of the books. So what I did is I took a piece of paper and I made sure that it was at least a 1/2 inch seam allowance on each end. So I made sure that it was at least 9.5 inches long in order to give myself some seam allowance. And then I wrapped this around the book, giving myself a 1/2 inch seam allowance along all the edges here. And I extended the paper and folded it in so that I could create that inside fold flap. Now you don't have to do any of this since I'm going to be giving you the exact measurements and we're going to be drawing it together. But this is how I determined how long I needed my piece of paper to be, is by taking a piece of paper and folding it inside, cutting it down, and then measuring the piece. So that is how I came up with the determination on how long this needed to be. It was the same for creating the thinner version for my smaller books as well. So for this pattern, I'm going to use construction paper. It is what is available in my stash at the moment, and I wanted to be able to show you an option just in case you don't have tracing paper or pattern making paper. So what I did is tape together 2 pieces of construction paper here. I'm going to take the ruler, and I know I need my book cover to be 18 inches long, so I'm going to actually put the ruler on there and create dots so that I can make the most perfect straight line. Now I know I won't be using the full height of this piece of paper. I just want to make sure that my lines are perfectly straight when I start drawing and cutting. So I will just go ahead and do the full length of this. You don't have to do this, and honestly, if you're using printer paper, it won't be this long, but this is what I have. So I just want to make sure that I'm getting the most perfect measurement for my book cover. So there we go. Now that I've created these dots, I'm going to draw off a straight line. So I'm connecting the ruler to all the dots. I hope you can see that. And I'm creating my first line. Now we're going to address the height of the pattern. So I have measured up to 9.5 inches, and I'm going to create those dots that I did for the length. And I'm going to continue to create those dots at the 9.5 inch marking on my ruler all the way across. And then I will connect those dots to make my line. Now I'm lining the ruler up along those dots, and I see that they're not perfect, but I'll line them along that line, and this is our main pattern piece. And so what we've done now is we've created a width of 18 inches. So I'm just marking that, 18 inches. And then a length here of 9.5 inches. So that is the length and the width of our pattern piece. This is not where we stop with this guy. First, we're going to go ahead and cut off the excess paper that we don't need. And we will be using what's left of this paper for another pattern piece in just a minute. But let's go ahead and cut this off. here is your main pattern piece. Now, as you can see here, I have created a slant on the edge of the piece that folds in. I think that looks really nice, but you do not have to do that if you do not want to. And I want to show you how I did that. So what you're going to do is you are going to take your ruler and you are going to mark down at 1 inch and create a dot. And then you go across the top and do the same. Create another dot at 1 inch. Then you're going to connect the dots to make this line here. Now you can choose to cut this off, or you can choose to fold it in so that you have some flexibility as to whether or not you want to use it or not. I personally enjoy using it, but for the sake of this video, I will just fold it in. And we're going to go ahead and make a dot there. And there you have it. So in order to create the shape that I have here, what you're going to do is fold this right on the line. And you can fold it on the front or on the back, it's up to you. But that's how we're going to create that corner when you're cutting your fabric. And there you go. Now we're going to move into the second pattern piece that you'll be creating. And the second pattern piece is going to be the pocket that you see here that you slip your book cover into. So what you're going to do is you're going to take what's left over of the paper that you had before. And now for this pattern piece, I measured out how far I wanted the paper to fold in on my book. And so I determined that the width was going to be 4.5 inches and the length was going to be the same length as this so that it meets up perfectly, because you will be sandwiching your fabric pieces together. And so that length is still 9.5. So let's go ahead and start there. We are going to do a 9.5 dot. And we're going to go ahead and make sure that we get this at 4.5 inches of width. So we're going to go ahead and measure out 4.5 inches and create a little dot. And then down here, we're going to do the same at 4.5 inches. And we're going to create a dot. And now you're just going to use your ruler to join those two dots together. And that is going to give you your second pattern piece for this. And go ahead and mark those widths and lengths. So again, this is 4.5 inches. And this right here is going to be your 9.5 inches. And again, I did create this pattern piece by measuring the books that I had in my collection that I am trying to cover. You can do the same steps in order to create a length and the width that works perfectly with the books that you are trying to cover. Not all books are the same, but it did seem as though quite a few of my books were around the same measurements. So go ahead and mark your pattern pieces. I'm going to mark this as piece number 2. And this is piece number 1. I'm also going to write on here what I need of each. And so I'm going to need 1 main fabric, 1 lining fabric, and 1 batting or foam. Okay, so again, depending on what you're using, some people don't even use a batting or a foam as a layer to go on the inside. I choose to do that because I like the spongy feel of it. If you wanted to just do fabric, you can do that. I just think that it doesn't protect the book quite as well as using a batting or a foam. Another thing to consider is I used regular cotton fabric. You may use to choose something that is water resistant, like a canvas that has been coated or something of that nature, to give your book even more protection. Now for the second piece, you are going to need 1 main fabric, and you're going to need 1 lining fabric. no batting and no foam for the pocket. And the reason why is because it is going to reduce the bulk on the inside of your cover. So your pattern pieces are complete. Prior to cutting out your fabric pieces, you're going to make sure that you go ahead and iron your fabric really well so that you get the exact measurement as your pattern pieces that you cut out. And you are going to have now your exterior fabric, your lining fabric, which I chose to use the seam print for the lining. And then you're going to need your foam or your batting piece. And now I chose to use the fusible foam so that it's easier and I can treat these two as one piece. So this is my lining piece. And as I mentioned before, these pieces have been completely ironed prior to cutting them, but I did also run this iron over the pieces to fuse them together so that I could treat them as one piece. Now we're going to move on to working on the insert or the pocket that goes on the exterior of the book cover. So let's move this off to the side. And I did forget to mention that you do need a iron for this project. So I have my two pieces here and they are wrong sides together, and that's exactly how we want them to be. And what we are going to be doing is creating that clean folded edge on the inside of the book cover. And so go ahead and make sure that you knock out any wrinkles if there were any, and you probably had already done that when you ironed your fabric prior to cutting. So just in case you didn't, now we have a nice smooth flat piece. Now you are going to either use a heat resistant ruler or you can just go ahead and eyeball it. And what we're going to do is line these two pieces up perfectly just like this. We are going to use our ruler in order to fold the fabric in at 1/4 of an inch and iron it all the way down. And I love using a hot hem ruler because I can leave the iron on it and it does not melt or burn on my project. This particular one I believe is made out of a thick fleece, so it works really nicely. So now that I have folded it in 1/4 of an inch, I'm going to go ahead and take the ruler again and we're going to fold it in at another 1/4 of an inch measurement and go ahead and make sure that's nice and perfect. You're going to tuck in that edge and make sure that it meets up at 1/4 of an inch all the way down, and you're going to iron it down one more time. Now you can use some of those hot head pins. That would be actually really good at this stage in order to keep your fabric folded. But I personally just did not feel like taking them out, so here you go. Now we have our inside edge folded in. I have my creased lines created by the iron, and I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine and I'm going to stitch down right on the edge there at 1/4 inch all the way down, and that is going to give us a nice clean edge for the inside of our book cover. We should have a really nice long line of stitches there down the edge of our pocket flap. Now that you have ironed and stitched down the fold of your edge of your pocket piece, we are going to set this off to the side, and we are going to now work on the elastic pieces for the book cover. And I am going to go ahead and add 2 elastic pieces to test my theory about folding this over the outside of the book. And so we know that this needs to be a length of 9.5 inches. So just go ahead and measure that out and cut it at 9.5 inches. You're going to want to cut 2 of those. So I am just going to be lazy and line it up just like this, and I am going to cut 2 of them the same length. Now we are going to determine where those elastic pieces should be placed on your book cover. The first thing I want to do is I want to line up the edge of my book at 1/2 inch seam allowance on the edge here, making sure that it's also 1/2 inch along the top and the bottom for your seam allowance, making sure everything lines up perfectly, and this will help us to get a better determination as to where the elastic should go. The first thing I want to do is fold this on the outside because I do want to add 2 pieces of elastic, one to be able to close this book cover on the outside and one for the inside. So I think that this is a nice place to have the first piece of elastic is right here. So right at that 1 inch mark that we had earlier to create this diagonal, I'm going to put my first piece of elastic there. So I'll go ahead and use my fabric clips to add that here. And now if you want to, instead of using elastic, create a snap closure, you can do that as well. All right, so then that's the first piece of elastic, and this is the elastic that will hopefully go around the outside of the book cover. Now the second piece of elastic is what's going to attach this flap to the inside of your book and hold it in place. And so what you're going to do is fold this in without moving this book, fold it into the inside, and you're going to determine where exactly you want to place your elastic. And for me, I am going to go ahead and measure it, and I want to actually have mine at 3 inches from the edge. So I'm going to take that second piece of elastic, and I see my fold here, so I'm going to go ahead and put a clip at the fold line here. So I've placed this clip at the measurement where I want my next piece of elastic to go. And so what I know is that after measuring it, I need to take my ruler and line it up so that it is 3 inches from the edge of the outside of this clip. So 1, 2, 3, and this is where I want my second piece of elastic to be. So I have my first piece of elastic here and my second piece of elastic here, and that is the part that's going to go over the inside of the book and secure the pages down. So go ahead and take your clips and clip it on either side. Then you're going to go over to the sewing machine and you are going to stitch your elastic in place. What I recommend to do in order to secure your elastic so that it lasts over time is right under 1/2 of an inch. You can do 1/4 of an inch or even slightly more than that. You're going to go back and forth over the elastic several times to secure it in place. You want to stay within the 1/2 inch seam allowance. We will be trimming it, but we don't want to trim those stitches because we want them to be nice and secure. So you're going to go ahead and stitch a few lines over on the edge here, right within the 1/2 inch seam allowance. And you're going to do all 4 sides and then come back to your table. Okay, now that we have stitched down our 2 pieces of elastic in the positions that we want them to be, we are going to create a sandwich. So we are going to take this piece, and it is right side facing up. We're going to take our pocket edge and we are going to place it right here. And this is the right side that we'll see when we open our book. And I see that I have a loose thread here, so I'm going to go ahead and clip that away. And what we're going to do now is we are going to take our exterior fabric, the main piece of fabric, we're going to sandwich it on top here. And we are going to line it up so that the edges are perfectly matched. We are going to be pinning or clipping all the way around here, and we're going to leave a section here in the middle to where we can turn the pattern out. And so you're not going to stitch an opening here right in the middle because we need to be able to turn it right side out after we've stitched the edges together. So go ahead and line up your pieces, and you are going to pin all the way around and make sure everything is sandwiched perfectly and flat and that the edges line up really nicely. So I'm just going ahead all the way around, and in order to make it to where I don't make a mistake and stitch this close, I am going to put the pins or clips closer together so that I can clearly see where my opening is as I go ahead and stitch. Okay, now using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, I am going to go ahead and stitch 1/2 inch all the way along the edges here. Again, leaving an opening here in the middle so that I can turn my project right side out. Okay, now that we've done our stitching all around the edges, we are going to go ahead and trim off the excess seam allowance in order to make sure that when we turn it right side out, it's not too bulky in the corners. And so what you're going to do is, actually, let's start in the corners. We are clipping it really close. It's actually going to be a little over 1/8 of an inch of an edge there, and right on these spiky corners of that shape that we created on the edge, you want to make sure we do a diagonal across that edge. Don't cut into your seams, but you want it to make it so that it's smooth for you to turn your project right side out. And so go ahead and trim around all the way around your pattern piece some of this excess seam allowance. Now when you are creating your pattern, if you want to reduce the amount of fabric waste, you can choose to actually not do a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I just found that for myself, I felt a little bit safer by giving myself a larger seam allowance for mistakes. So go ahead, like I said, and trim all the way around the edges of your project. And again, on those pointy corners, you're going to cut diagonally, not in the stitches, but right at the tip of the stitches, so that it's easier and smoother when we turn it right side out. One problem that I encountered that you might also encounter is that your outer exterior fabric may stretch in the process of pressing it and then attaching it to the other layers. So as you're sewing it together, you might find that you have a bit of a baggy top main fabric piece. It might even extend longer than the other layers of your pattern piece. Just go ahead and trim off the excess and you'll be fine. Okay, so here we go. We have our piece here. We are going to now turn it right side out. So you're going to take that little piece that you left open. You're going to stick your hand inside and try to grab one of these corners, and you're going to pull the whole thing out right side out. Okay, now this is a good point in the process that if you want to go ahead and get a point turner, so if you have a point turner in your sewing supplies, you can go ahead and get that in order to help you poke out the inside corners of this project. However, if you are not someone that owns a point turner, you can gently use either a pencil, a pen, or a marker of something with a pointy edge to poke the corners out so that you have a nice crisp edge. And I'm actually going to go ahead and get a point turner. You don't want to use scissors because you can actually poke through your stitches and create a hole. So find something in your stash, whether it be a pencil or an actual point turner, and go ahead and poke out these corners. You'll know that you need to push out the corners more if you see that there is a dip or dive in that corner. So you're just going to keep poking until you get a nice smooth edge. And if it is more rounded, it will have something to do with the way that you stitched it. If it bothers you, you can unpick it and stitch more neatly. But me, I don't really get too hung up on those things. So long as I know it's going to fit my book, which it should, I'm not going to be too picky about that at this time. And so now you're going around and you're poking, just making sure that all those edges are poked out. And once you've done that, you are going to flip this over so that you're not on the side that has the elastic. You're going to flip it over to this side, and actually this pocket should be flipped on the inside here. And you're going to go ahead and poke that corner out as well, because this is our pocket piece. It should be on the lining side of your book cover. So again, poking those corners, making sure that it is as smooth as possible, pointy as possible. Okay, so now this is what the inside of your book cover should look like. You're going to flip it to the outer exterior side, and we are going to get our irons out and give it a little press. And we're doing this so that it's nice and flat on the edges. We want it to look as nice and pristine and smooth as possible. If you are like me, you like nice crisp edges. So I plan on doing a top stitch along the tops and sides of this book cover. However, if you think it's going to take away from the size of your book cover based off of how you stitched it, you can absolutely skip that portion. But I do find in creating a top stitch along the edges that it also helps the book cover to be flatter. And as you already know, because we used a foam or batting, it's already puffy. So having that extra stitch just gives it more structure. So now I'm on the inside of the pattern piece, and I'm just working out any wrinkles that I've created when I turn the pattern piece inside out, or the fabric pieces inside out or right side out. So I'm being careful not to iron my elastic because elastic could melt under this iron. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to now take the edge here that we left an opening. I'm going to fold this in, and it should be around 1/8 of an inch, however much is left from when you trimmed your seam allowance. So go ahead and fold in that edge because we are going to close this opening. And when I'm closing this opening, I'm actually going to stitch a really close, scant 1/8 of an inch right around the edges to make it nice and smooth. And I'm going to be closing up this hole with that line of stitches. So we're going to go ahead and iron this really nicely. I folded in those raw edges, and I'm going to go ahead and pin it so that while I'm stitching, it doesn't pop open. You see how it wants to pop open, and it's because of that foam. And you're going to have the same issue if you choose to use batting instead of foam. It's just thick and it doesn't want to be folded over. So you're going to go ahead and, as closely as possible to the edge, you're going to fold in that tiny little bit of width and pin it together. And now you're going to go ahead and stitch around the edges. And like I mentioned before, you can go ahead and go all the way around, or you can choose to do the edges, or you can skip that and just close the hole. Totally up to you. I'm going to go ahead and do my edge stitching. Okay, now we have our nice book cover completed. As you can see, this is what the finished result looks like. And as I mentioned before, I did have some areas where my fabric was stretched out. The bottom, you can kind of feel where I've closed that opening, but it's not terribly noticeable. So this is the inside of the book cover. This is the outside. What we're going to do now to make sure that everything fits perfectly is we're going to go ahead and take our book, and you're going to slip in. I like to take not just the cover, but a few pages from the beginning of the book. Oop, there's a bookmark. I'm going to take a few pages from the beginning, and we'll go right here and slip that on the inside pocket here. Make sure that it fits. And as I mentioned before, if you don't do a top stitch, it will give you a little bit more wiggle room at the top and the bottom, but this seems to fit pretty nicely. So I'm going to go ahead and slip it all the way in and try my hardest not to bend any of the edges of the pages or the actual cover. I'm going to close it over just like this and see how it lands, and that looks really good. Now I'm going to turn it over to the back side, and again I'm going to take some pages along with that back cover to slip in here just to give it a little bit more hold. You can even take more than that. You can take about like that much to slip it right there, and so that'll hold it in place. If you want, while reading, which is what I plan to do, I'm going to go ahead and fold in this inside flap here so that it is holding those pages nice and secure while I'm reading. And so this is what it will look like when I'm reading it. But now, since I've created that extra piece of elastic, I can leave this to hold the pages, and I close the book, and now I can take this, take that extra piece of elastic and wrap it around, in theory, to the back of the book. And now that holds my book nice and secure and closed, so the pages do not get messed up when I am throwing this in my book bag or my purse or my tote bag. So there you have it. There is our handmade book cover, and you can kind of move it around to make sure it fits perfectly and looks nice. But isn't that gorgeous? So we are all set to go. Your book is protected, perfect for on the go. You can throw this under your arm or in your bag, and it will not mess up your book. Very nice. So again, while I plan to read it, I am going to just simply fold this fabric right to the inside of the book. And this is how all of my other book covers that I've made in the past have been. There you have it, the perfect fabric book cover. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, please do give me a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe to my channel. I hope you have a fantastic day and a wonderful week. Bye.